evening. Great to see a full room. I'm David Cataforis, Professor and Chair of the Art History Department at the University of Kansas. I would like to acknowledge that the University of Kansas resides on the ancestral territory of the Kaw people, who were forced off their land by the United States in the 19th century and largely relocated to Oklahoma. This acknowledgement recognizes Native Americans as traditional guardians of the land and the enduring relationship between Native peoples and these traditional territories. I'm pleased to welcome you to this evening's Franklin D. Murphy lecture by Professor Paul Binski. This is the second of two Murphy lectures by Professor Binski. He delivered the first, Experiencing Medieval Architecture, remotely from the UK on October 5th. And we're delighted that the recent lifting of travel restrictions from Europe to the US makes it possible for him to be here in person to deliver the second lecture this evening. It's also being streamed online, and I extend a warm welcome to all of you who are watching it on screen. Of course, there's a screen in this room also. Professor Binski joins us as both the Franklin D. Murphy Lecturer and the Franklin D. Murphy Professor. During his residency, he is co-teaching in a seminar that Professor Aureli Marina is running for the whole semester, entitled Persuasive Form, Medieval Sculpture. Professor Binski's public lectures are the latest in the series established in 1979 through the Kansas University Endowment Association in honor of former Chancellor Franklin D. Murphy, who led KU from 1951 to 1960. The Murphy Lectureship in Art brings distinguished art historians, critics, and artists to the University of Kansas, where they participate in the teaching of a graduate seminar in the Crest Foundation Department of Art History and deliver two public lectures. Normally, these lectures are delivered at the Spencer Museum of Art and at the Nelson Atkins Museum of Art, but we've had to depart from that tradition this fall due to the pandemic. Most of the lectures are subsequently developed into books published by the University of California Press in association with the Crest Foundation Department of Art History and the Spencer Museum of Art, and we look forward to the publication of Dr. Binski's book in that distinguished series. And now I'm happy to welcome my colleague Aureli Marina to the platform, who will introduce Dr. Binski.
I am so pleased, you have no idea how pleased, to introduce Professor Paul Binski's second lecture on the theme of making sense of medieval art as our 2021 Franklin D. Murphy Lecture in Art History. Those of you who were here virtually last time in October know that Professor Binski comes to us as Professor Emeritus of the History of Medieval Art at the University of Cambridge, a Fellow of the British Academy, and a Fellow of the Society of Antiquaries, among many, many other distinguished credentials. He has also taught at the Universities of Manchester, and he began his career here with us in the United States at Yale University. And so it is a very joyful experience to welcome him back to the prairie in this case. Professor Binski also comes to us as one of the most imaginative and fruitful interpreters of the art of medieval Europe in many media and at many scales, from the illuminated manuscript to the great church. I mean fruitful quantitatively as well as qualitatively, as his bibliography extends to more than 150 publications over the span of 30 years, including 6 books as sole author, each to considerable critical acclaim. The Painted Chamber at Westminster was his first major book from 1986. Painters, a book written for a general audience by the British Museum from 1991. Westminster Abbey and the Plantagenets, Kingship and the Representation of Power, 1200 to 1400 from 1995. Medieval Death, Ritual and Representations, 1996. Beckett's Crown, Art and Imagination in Gothic England, 1170 to 1300 from 2004. Gothic Wonder, Art, Artifice, and the Decorated Style, 1290 to 1350, 2014. And, of course, the latest Gothic sculpture, Yale University Press, 2019. Beckett's Crown and Gothic Wonder in particular have informed the way I think and teach about art and the architecture of the late medieval world, and in fact about just monumental arts in general. Most recently, Gothic sculpture took aim at what has been called a new age of golden age of medieval sculpture by using the medium to devise nothing less than a new theory of medieval representation. Professor Binski also inspired the theme of this year's graduate seminar, as Professor Cataforis just let us know, on persuasive form, the means and ends of medieval sculpture. 6 graduate students and I have had the benefit of his insights as we explored the subject this semester. He boldly traveled to be with us in person this week when his participation in the seminar culminated with 6 seminar presentations and a concluding classroom session on the art-life divide. You will hear a little bit about that and more in today's lecture, the second as part of the Murphy series, Figures, Fictions, and Motives in Medieval Art. Please join me in welcoming Professor Paul Binski. Is this too bright? Would you like to win a little dinner?
No, it's fine for me. Well, thank you so much for that warm welcome, and I just want to say, first of all, that this is a great honour, and it seemed to me imperative that the moment President Biden allowed people to travel, that I should travel. I've beamed over, by the way. No, there's no how can I put it? There's been a certain amount of bureaucracy, but here I am anyway, with the greatest pleasure. And I do just want to say thank you to David and to Areli for their exemplary, splendid and thoughtful hospitality. I've had a great time in the last few days. It's been intense, but I've greatly enjoyed meeting the talented students that are here, and it just seemed to me the right thing to do, to turn up, and so here I am. My paper is philosophical in tone, it must be said, so I hope you will bear with me, but my purpose is a far-reaching one. This is partly about sculpture, but it is really about representation in general. So, let's begin with T.S. Eliot. Murder in the Cathedral. Far, far, far in the past, and I wander in a land of barren boughs. If I break them, they bleed. I wander in a land of dry stones. If I touch them, they bleed. In my first lecture, delivered online on experiencing medieval architecture, I drew attention to the way that medieval architectural experience was at least as engaged with human and sensory values as it was with theology and transcendence. To argue as much is immediately to declare myself a heretic. Today, I want to develop some different but related thoughts about representation by looking at the very human issues of emotion and motivation. In all cases, my approach is less to do with style or meaning than with the way artifacts work. But to do so, let's begin where we left off, with a very famous medieval church. Last year commemorated the 800th anniversary of the translation in the year 1220 of the relics of St. Thomas Becket from his miracle-working tomb in the crypt of Canterbury Cathedral to a great shrine in the lofty Trinity Chapel above. Here it is. Canterbury Cathedral, as rebuilt after 1174, with freestones and marbles, is a highly coloured, glossy building, paired columns of rose, pink, white, green marble, framing the shrine area there, the candle, the solitary candle indicating where the greatest shrine in Europe of its type once stood until Henry VIII cleared it out. The floor is blanketed with rose-coloured marble, and we now know the walls of the aisles painted originally blood red. Red and rose, the colours of martyrdom. T.S. Eliot was right. His image of the stones bleeding is, of course, a metaphor, but it ties in with the possible intention of these marbles, which was to create a material invocation of the sentiment in the Song of Songs, "My beloved is white and ruddy, the chiefest among 10,000. This image was used more than once by Becket's biographers to gloss the spilling, the terrible facts of his death, the spilling of his brains and blood on the cathedral pavement in the year 1170. There's an image of it, early image of it on the right-hand side. The spectator is to see and understand the columns and flooring in the light of a theological exegesis of martyrdom, or better, is to come to see them under a particular aspect, once theological understanding has done its work. The notion that the prophets and the saints were columns of the church, which I mentioned in my first lecture, was a familiar poetic association, a metaphor. It isn't a literal resemblance because metaphors aren't literally true, but metaphors illuminate by suggesting a resemblance. Importantly, no actual belief is involved in this imaginative step. We can't prove and we can't disprove the idea that the stones, the columns, are Beckett. Rather, the stones become the subject of a getting to see, which is the product of a persuasive activity. The metaphor becomes a form of extension, which is guidable and teachable, and which leads to a circle of mutual enrichment and a heightening of experience and understanding. This dynamic process of getting to see creatively beyond what is literally there is extensively documented in medieval art reception. In my last lecture, I mentioned the case of the use of columns in the Constantinian basilicas, in which the martyrs could be recognised, as at Canterbury. This is an instance of what is known generally as a transferred epithet, of the sort I mentioned when thinking about a building possessing human virtues, human qualities. In talking about architecture, I sketched in the idea that medieval experience language reads across from people to artefacts and back again. Thus, we can speak of people being noble or beautiful or dazzling or cheerful. But we can also speak of artefacts as having those qualities. And because those qualities can transfer back from object to subject, the process is reflexive. The positive, noble, cheerful effects of a building can instill those affects in us, can magnify us, make us great, and not diminish us. So when, at late 12th century Canterbury, the martyr Thomas Becket was likened to a column of the church in Pauline or Eusebian fashion, he too was held up as a model to imitate. Such buildings didn't make us nothing, they made us something. I also gave the instance of Procopius's 6th century description of the mosaics of the Chalky, the vestibule of the imperial palace in Constantinople. Let's stick with Justinian here, with its images of Justinian's great deeds, his magnificence. These scenes, says Procopius, are indicated by the mosaic cubes, which on their faces take on a joyful bloom. The cubes, he says, smile proudly as they offer the emperor divine honours because of the magnificence of his achievements. Well, of course, the mosaics don't literally smile, only metaphorically, because metaphors are a commonplace of the ancient and medieval rhetorical practice of ekphrasis, the literary method of bringing things before the mind's eye by means of language. Ekphrasis describes, but it also prescribes. It suggests a way of seeing things. Now here I follow in the footsteps of some very celebrated essays on ekphrastic writing about marbles and what can be seen in them. I cite the work of John Onions, Fabio Barry, John Mitchell, and Finbar Flood. Fabio Barry has helped us all to walk on water in regard to Byzantine pavements here at Hagia Sophia. Marbled floors are seen as frozen seas in writers of the time. When Paulus Silentarius uses ekphrasis in order, as he says, to paint, materials are made to look like other things. They're a lively, winning masquerade. John Mitchell and Finbar Flood have written about the emergence of faces in the columns and revetments of churches such as Porec on the left and San Vitale in Ravenna on the right. And I'm sure I don't need to persuade you that there's a face there. But you might like to pause on this image for a moment. Is this some sort of ghastly, bug-eyed bat with wings here? Yeah. Or is it a monk with a face and a hood and a white and a lap? I don't know if this is, sorry, I'm trying to, yeah. Do you see what I mean? The key thing is I can talk to that image and try to get you to see it in one way or another way. And that's fundamental to what I'm going to say shortly. You can refuse my interpretation. You can see it another way because no belief is involved in that manoeuvre. Let me give you an example where belief may be challenged. Herb Kessler has recently and brilliantly invoked this tradition in connection with the representations of the Virgin Mary as a column, going back to our metaphor. This is the Madrid Escorial copy of the famous 13th century illustrated volumes of the Songs of Praise to the Virgin, Las Cantigas. I don't think this needs any explanation. There is the Virgin Mary appearing mysteriously as a column. Well, this process of getting to see, here we are at Mount Sinai, an icon of Christ, getting to see creatively beyond the literal properties of a thing is extensively documented in medieval art reception. Usually at work, as I've hinted with my brief discussion of the monk in the marble, is a voluntary conjuration of other images, other materials, which opens out a question about what imaginatively a material is, if it isn't something that can be perceived as a fiction. Modern aesthetics regard this ability to see an aspect of a thing as a power of the imagination, which indeed it is. In Augustinian and scholastic thought in the Middle Ages, imagination is that faculty of recollection involved in invention itself. The type of imaginative seeing that can perceive a figure in a wall, a sea in a pavement, or mosaic cubes as smiling, isn't a passive, but an active re-imagination which involves free will, or what they called voluntas, as well as judgment. The Greco-Roman world already had an informed body of philosophical reflection on this method of recollection and extension from stuff to mind, such that we can actively reconfigure what it is that we're seeing in front of us. Because indeed imagination is a faculty of recollection, Aristotle, who's a good starting point for this, appropriately moves towards this in his great De Memoria, where he discusses this whole problem in regard to representation. It's an aspect of memory theory. He says, and looking at this image now, a picture painted on a panel is at once a picture and a likeness. That is, while one and the same, it is both of these, although the being of both is not the same. One may contemplate it either as a picture or as a likeness. What he's saying is you can see this as a configuration or you can see it as a face, as a representation. There's an element of voluntas, of free will in it. It becomes a likeness of someone, and Aristotle in this case talks about a man called Coriscus. I recognise that it's Coriscus because my faculty of perception is a recollective faculty. You see, that's why it appears in De Memoria. Even if we haven't seen Coriscus, as it were, we could be persuaded of this. Note that it is possible to see the image either way, as a configuration or as an image, and that to see a likeness of someone is to apprehend it as a memory of an absent somebody, rather than something inhering in the image. It isn't Coriscus, this isn't Christ, it's an image of Christ, which reminds us of Christ, even though we haven't seen Christ. And this double seeing, this capacity to see configuration or likeness, is later alluded to by a medieval Aristotelian, Thomas Aquinas. Well, in all these various ways, medieval imaginative theory recognised something that we think about and worry about still in modern aesthetics. I don't have time to review the entire history of fantasia and imagination through the early modern periods, except to raise the work of one modern writer who I think has touched on this question. I mean Richard Volheim, one of a generation of post-World War II analytical philosophers influenced by the later work of Ludwig Wittgenstein. To these 20th century thinkers, the perception of artifacts represents a particular and not a general problem. Such perception came to be called aspectual seeing, seeing a thing under a particular aspect, or seeing in. Volheim's fundamental intervention is found in an appendix to the second edition of his book Art and Its Objects, published in 1980. Here, he refined Wittgenstein's account of aspectual seeing, or what he called seeing as. And this is where my lecture, there's a momentary knot in this way where we have to be careful because this is quite difficult, so forgive me, but I'll do my best. By distinguishing between what he called an essentially involuntary seeing as and a voluntary seeing in. So far I've been talking about seeing in. Seeing a monk in a marble is seeing in. It isn't to see it as a monk, it is to see a monk in the marble. A nice distinction, but an absolutely fundamental one because it raises the question of belief. Now, of late, and interestingly, I mentioned a slew of distinguished publications about this point about ekphrasis. I have not seen Richard Volheim's work acknowledged in this, and yet I think it is a fundamental way of understanding what's going on. Well, a moment ago, we saw that Aristotle argued that seeing a picture and seeing a likeness in it are possible readings. As with our marbles, we may get to see an image, we may be talked into it. This type of perception is persuadable, a goal-oriented activity, and hence it's profoundly social. Volheim calls this seeing in. So, aspectual seeing involves the ability to see beyond what is presented to us. In this sense, it's creative or compositorial, because memory, recollection, and invention are faculties. They're all related. And they're compositorial in a way ordinary perception, including optical illusions, is not. It is an aspect of invention. Ekphrasis is, after all, a branch of rhetoric. So, while I can talk you into seeing a face in a marble, or to give a famous instance, the most famous instance, really, I suppose, a duck or a rabbit. So sorry, do you see this? Well, you presumably have seen the duck-rabbit configuration, and I can persuade you to see it as a rabbit looking that way or a duck looking that way. You can't see both. You can't see it at the same time, and you do not believe that a duck or a rabbit is actually involved in this. I can talk you one way or the other, but I can't talk you out of the optical illusion underneath. That's just there. That involves that's a given. It involves a question of simply what is out there. So, to turn to Hamlet, if I see water or a face in marble, or if I apprehend a saint in stone, or if I indeed see a camel in a cloud, as in that famous exchange between Hamlet and Polonius, I'm giving you some Renaissance clouds there. If that's how I see it, I'm seeing these things under the aspect of what it is, in this case a camel or horses or riders and so on. Now, in contrast, seeing as precisely raises the issue of belief. I've no choice but to see as, and this experience isn't a twofold one. You can't switch and go to and fro. It's an either or. So, turning to the beautiful polychrome Norwegian image of the Virgin Mary there from the 13th century on the left-hand side, a perfectly preserved image. If I see a statue of the Virgin Mary as the Virgin Mary, or indeed if, under exceptional conditions of miracle, for example, the statue becomes the Virgin Mary, which is not unheard of in medieval literature, my belief about reality is also challenged in a way that is involuntary. That is precisely what gives a miracle its force, after all, its exceptional status within a body of belief norms. It goes against what we normally believe, hence it's miraculous. Where belief enters in, volition or choice depart. So, while seeing in provides us with many artful and freely chosen devices of use in the arts, conjuration, poetry, metaphor, seeing as, in contrast, fundamentally alters the truth claim of the thing seen. The miraculous change seems closer, as I suggest, to the remit of seeing as. The miraculous, by its nature, creates not a fictional state, but a new reality. Well, this insight has consequences for two closely related areas, currently the subject of a great deal of discussion: materiality and illusion. Because perception and experience necessarily involve mind and imagination, they are inherently mediated. The intentional object of this mediation is the appearance of the thing, its perceived surface, the statue with its paint and so on. This apparency, what to Aristotle would be known as fantasia, isn't literal or physical, and nor does it entail a specific belief. And this has consequences for the understanding of stuff promoted by some modern versions of image anthropology. In my book on Gothic sculpture, published recently and kindly referred to earlier, I noted that some materialists regard material as all substance, articulate in and through itself. Materials may be overt, pregnant with significance, per se living, and so on. But to my mind, this raises certain questions about the criticism and historical understanding of artifacts and fictions, materials as fictions, rather than materials as materials. While, at least according to early modern empiricism, materials are substances existing in and through themselves, they also have qualities. Qualities are contingent upon substances, which are necessarily implicated in a world of thinking, feeling human subjects, and in that compositorial, recollective power of the imagination I mentioned earlier. Now, qualities of things are emergent, which is to say that together they form a larger whole. Emergence is a matter of perception, of that which is apparent, and that requires a percipient, somebody to look at it. Practically and metaphorically, of course, we know what we mean when we speak of the character of a material. But that thought cannot be reduced to or explained by the material and its potentiality alone. The experienced working of a material, wood, marble, stone, alabaster, ivory, etc., requires both a sense of what is realizable and also of what is poetic. And each of these is a matter of human judgment. And remember the origin of the idea of poetry, poesis, in making. It is literally the making of things, poesis. Our experience of materials is, in short, inherently mediated and interpretative, not transparent. And so too is our experience of form. To speak technically for a moment, I take a hylomorphic or non-dualist view of form as having ontological priority over matter. The formal cause prevails over the material cause, but the two are inseparable. That goes quite contrary to some modern materiality studies which place materiality absolutely at the head of the hierarchy. The emergent aesthetic properties of a thing are, of course, dependent on its non-aesthetic properties because substances and qualities, facts and values hold together. The point is that in artifactual criticism, art history, call it what you will, form and matter should be discussed together, not separately. How things appear to us is at least as important as what they are really made of. It is the task of science, not criticism, to dispense with appearances or apparency and explain the physical realities. The risk of this strand of materiality theory that I'm referring to isn't only that in dispensing with form it risks a kind of damaging dualism. Dispensing with appearance also entails dispensing with illusion. Here are two illusions, both in Poitiers. The one on the lower right I think is particularly enjoyable. By this reading, illusion is a master discourse of Italian Renaissance painting. I mean, by the materialist reading, illusion is a master discourse of Italian Renaissance painting and pictorial space. It isn't proper to medieval art, which is to be returned instead to its materiality. In my book on Gothic sculpture, I've already set out my scepticism about the categorical idea that medieval art knows no concept of illusion. And my opening paragraphs on the wonderful conjuration of ekphrasis perhaps shows why. For, bar the class of involuntary illusions, illusion is often a form of aspectual seeing. It isn't a matter of mistaken belief. The Oxford English Dictionary's insistence that illusion is a matter of false belief or deception doesn't help here. Illusion isn't delusion. To see a smile in a mosaic or a mosaic cube doesn't involve belief or deception at all. On the contrary, certain types of depiction are cleverly unreal and are understood as such. They are undeceived depictions in an unreal and yet graspable world, and we can be talked into and out of them. Such artifacts are figments involving no dishonesty and a pleasure in being seen as such, the pleasure of being consensually taken in. Coleridge, the poet, has this in mind when he writes of the willing suspension of disbelief. In the apprehension of a fiction, we enjoy our voluntary disbelief in it. We know fictions to be unreal, and we take pleasure precisely in the fact that the fiction isn't real. As Mary Carruthers says, and I quote, "Artifacts are always in play exactly on the ground created through the tension between figment and actual, as are their creators when making them, and we in experiencing them." End quote. Deny the distinction of a figment and reality, and the tension, the creative tension, vanishes. Deny illusion, and appearances vanish altogether. The upshot of this is that we need to take fiction seriously, and I want now to turn to the question of fiction and fictional immotivation and motivation, because I think this is one way into this, I think, rather important problem. So, the second part of my lecture of 3. We now enter more difficult territory, which opens out from that phrase, consensually taken in. I want now to look at some consequences of the idea of fiction as a form of imaginative perception. Back to Canterbury. At the start, I said that the coloured stones at Canterbury become the subject of a getting to see, of a persuasive activity which guides and teaches, and so deepens experience and understanding. We now see that there's an exegesis behind this, of Becket becoming sponsorially, as it were, the bride of Christ as a martyr, and so on. Experience and thought are integral. So the stone's colours and forms guide us, if suitably persuaded, to think harder about theology and martyrdom. The techniques of persuasion in the Middle Ages, being also those of the ancient world, assume quite rightly that persuasion isn't simply a mental thing. It's a cognitive activity, but it involves both mind and body, affects or passions, which is to say feelings, and thoughts. They don't work separately. To take pleasure in a fiction, voluntarily recognised as a fiction, is one aspect of the delight taken in perception as a conjoint somatic and cognitive activity. But what does this mean in the context of a medieval dispensation in which the arts not only create delight or pleasure, aspects that have been, I think, neglected in recent years, but which also serve belief, existing to affirm and inform that belief? To overemphasize the utility or instrumentality of medieval art is a bit reductive, and yet to deny that instrumentality seems somehow to disempower art, to deny that it had a purpose or end, and that it does work. In other words, I'm obviously not advancing a sort of a kind of art for art's sake aestheticism. The point about medieval art is that it operates within what Rancière calls an ethically driven regime. It serves a purpose. It has an instrumental character. A moment ago, I spoke about the inseparability of the formal and material causes, and so too with the issue of purpose, the final cause, in the generally accepted Aristotelian framework of causality. Usually when we speak of the use value or instrumentality of medieval art, we point to its function. And image anthropology has tended to encourage this. But function and purpose are not the same, for means and ends can and should be distinguished. Let's go to Compostela for a moment, the magnificent and terrifying portal of the great church of pilgrimage church at Compostela. A purely functional account of a portal or an altarpiece, or indeed any artefact, leaves much about it unconsidered. For instance, a great portal on a cathedral may function to admit people to the building, that's obvious, to set a tone of impressiveness, even awe, undoubted, to create an impressive array of witnesses, to din in information, dogma, doctrine, to act as a warning, to stir affects or passions, which assist that process. In such a case, I suggest affects or passions are instrumental. They're part of the function of the portal as an aspect of the various techniques it deploys, because sculpture is a medieval technology and it works towards an end. Another example, also sculpture, the wonderful Last Judgment at Autun in Burgundy, carved by Master Giselbertus, and this is the particularly vivid depiction of the poor punished in hell. And just notice the inscriptions, by the way. I know they're in Latin, but you can probably pick out terror, error, and finally horror at the end. This is medieval art is nothing if not subtle. And the guy having his head torn off and so on. Now, the point about this is that this portal isn't expressing for the sake of it. Affects, emotions, serve the purpose of conviction and confidence, firm belief. And finally, I would suggest those things that medieval art works towards. Not emotional feeling, but rather action. The outcome is action, prayer, repentance, the amending of life, the helping of one's neighbour, for that is the Christian message. To suggest that a portal displays emotion as an end is to confuse ends and means. The portal stirs us, terrifies us, pleases us, amuses us, in order to persuade and to motivate. Affects begin and move things along, but they don't conclude the process. Hence, the outcome of this is rather like a notion of fruitfulness. The matter to hand is treated pleasingly or strikingly, as here at Autun, but also, to use an Augustinian idea, fruitfully, utilis, that these images are to yield fruit in action, changed belief, conduct, that we flower, bear fruit, good fruit, as a result of the apprehension of these images. It's reasonable to see much medieval art as aiming to be fruitful in that Augustinian sense. For example, at Autun, the horror, the terror of the inscriptions framing the torments of the damned, vividly imagined, are fruitful if they make us think hard about our salvation and make us repent, because fear, as the Middle Ages knew very well, has its uses. And the same can be said about the slightly more decorous images from the Gothic era. Here we are about a century later at Reims in Champagne, the Last Judgment, and here are the wicked, including, notice, bishops, kings, friars, etc., being dragged off to hell by chains and tumbled into an enormous boiling cauldron. Very striking, very memorable, in its way quite amusing, and absolutely a conversation piece, because you're meant to talk about this and discuss it. That's the whole point. These things get you going. They don't tell you what the answer is, they get you to think. So key to my argument is getting beyond function alone and thinking much harder about purpose and intent. As I said, in an ethically directed regime that aims to change our conduct, ultimately, the audience's judgment and actions must be moulded by the process of persuasion. We saw earlier that imaginative seeing, the basis of ekphrasis, is a persuasive process where you can see it this way or that way and you could be talked in and out. And hence, ekphrasis is an aspect of rhetoric practically and technically. In classical rhetoric, the aim of oratory is to produce and to control emotions. Produce emotions in you rather than to express emotions. That's an important distinction which I'd like to explore. Emotions are produced in tandem with changing beliefs. Changed beliefs and feelings change our actions, and therefore they direct our motivation, which is a key word of my lecture. The control of emotion, the major concern of classical and medieval thought on emotions, is not the same as the absence of emotion. Well, in considering the role of passions and affects, those movements within us that are directed by external stimuli, they're bodily things. A passion or affect is a bodily movement or feeling, a funny feeling, that is induced externally. In considering this, I'm not a stony-faced inhabitant of what James Elkins has called the ivory tower of tearlessness. The idea that medieval artworks were there to persuade, and thus to direct motivation, places the relationship, complex as it is, between emotion and belief at the centre of our discussion. And in this sense, I'm fully paid up member of modern emotionology studies, but I take a slightly different line from some. Well, these questions have resurfaced in the last generation, you see, with an extraordinary level of interest in the emotions generally. Well, medieval thought on the emotions was heavily dependent upon Plato, Aristotle and his medieval followers, such as Avicenna in Arabic, and the Stoics. Back to Compostela, last time, for instance, apropos of the Stoics, I cited the role of the Stoic distinction between pain and pleasure in discussing the idea that the broad spaces of the pilgrimage church at Compostela made us happy, because Laetitia, happiness, is a broadening. Our desires and the physical forms of the buildings are related. I cite the Pilgrim's Guide of Compostela, which plays on the idea of latitudo and laetitia, that we are enlarged by these buildings and not diminished. I stress that because an emphasis on a medieval sublime tends to have the opposite consequence, that in Romantic fashion we're crushed and diminished by these buildings. That doesn't occur anywhere in medieval accounts of buildings, to the best of my knowledge. They enlarge us, they cheer us up, they have positive affects. So my concern is to place emotion historically in this way. The emotions too have a history, of course, because I'm a little sceptical about the slippage onto medieval objects of modern ideas of psychology and what I call expressivity. But what of the figurative arts, and especially the domain most invested in the Gothic era in emotions, sculpture and painting? A good topic is the wise and foolish virgins, as Jackie Jung has written wonderfully about this point. A German subject, strongly, it doesn't occur very much in other parts of Europe. On the left, the foolish virgins at Magdeburg and the foolish virgins at Erfurt from a century later on the right-hand side. There are wise virgins as well who smile at us complacently. Look very. They're not nearly so interesting, because for the same reason that hell is always much more fun in the end than heaven. The idea that medieval artworks were there to persuade and thus to direct motivation places the relationship, complex as it is, as I've said, between emotion and belief at the centre of our discussion. So, what are we to make of the figurative arts and sculpture? Well, my perspective is essentially cognitive. The emotions at their most complex and interesting are necessarily acculturated and do not divide simplistically into mind and body, reason and feeling. They engage both. And well, this belief runs against any assumption that emotions are naturalistic or that they operate in expressive realist terms. And that means that we ourselves cannot necessarily feel right in the face of images which are to us expressive. For example, the great German images of the wise and here the foolish virgins at Magdeburg and Erfurt. Are we meant to feel pity for them, or to see them as pitiable, or are they objects of contempt? Because there are, I think, interesting variations in the way these things can be read. Well, at this point, and I'll say more about pitiability in a moment, at this point we can return to our discussion of appearances and beliefs or opinions. In particular, we need to reflect more closely on our idea of expression, that a sculpted figure can be expressive of something. That's the natural thing to come up. We talk about a facial expression now because we're locked in English linguistically into the idea that faces are expressive. But that in the Middle Ages, they didn't use the word expression. A face was a cheer. Be of good cheer. Cheer up means smile. It doesn't mean express, yeah? So this question of expression is interesting. Since the shift from mimesis to expression, especially facial expression, which occurred from the time of 17th century theorists, such as Charles Lebrun, from them through to the Romantics, criticism has held that there is something that stands separately from, as it were, beyond the artifact which expresses it. To understand expression in this way is to deduce or infer something, a feeling outside of the expressive thing. So art became expressive, a concept arguably more proper to Romanticism than to medieval images, aiming not so much to express as to produce or admit responses. And the key thing is that they are designed, above all, to produce a response in you, because it's not what they feel that matters. It's what you feel that matters, because that affects your motivational capacities. To understand why this idea of an object expressing something may be anachronistic to the medieval mindset, we need to return to the idea that spectator engagement is an active and inventive process of the type I talked about earlier on. You see, in my view, artifacts possess agency primarily within the active and transactional situation of engagement and arbitration, what I call occasion. And this is a two-way process. The artifact isn't simply the cause of our emotion, but its object. Artifacts admit emotions, as Michael Baxendale put it in his study of limewood sculpture. In other words, we can project onto them what we feel, if you will. They're susceptible to being read or in a certain way. Emotions can be seen in such figures. So what the sculptural painter might be trying to get across is met by a push in the other direction, the audience's will, which is stimulated by the image but not wholly directed by it. Here's a sort of textbook sort of account of sculpture between 1150 and 1250 from the totem pole figures at Chartres on the left-hand side, the great Portail Royal at Chartres, about 1140, 1150. Halfway in the middle, the transept figures at Chartres about 1200, and then 50 or so years later, the famous smiling image of the angel, or the angels at Reims, on the west front at Reims. What this means is that the judgment that some images are more affective than others, for instance, as in this contrast here, which seems natural to us, it shouldn't be based on modern ideas of expressivity. The cool and lofty images at Chartres on the left-hand side admit emotions just as much, indeed possibly more so, than the more literal images, including the famous smiling angels at Reims. In other words, because they're less determining, the capacity to admit an emotion from you is far greater than the much more coercive imagery on the right-hand side, which it literally dictates what you should be feeling, and indeed what the image may or may not be feeling. The ones on the left-hand side, and indeed the ones in the middle, are more open to projection. We express onto them, if you will, not them onto us. So in this sense, they aren't part of some evolving history of consciousness, but rather of the technology of representation itself. That's a large point that I want to move away from. To repeat, what matters in the persuasive process is that images may be stimuli which get us to see them in a particular way, a very different idea from expression, and one far more like projection, or what came to be called the beholder's share. We, the audience, can give reasons, justify and articulate our response, and our responses are far from passive. Mary Carruthers remarks, I quote, "Rhetoric is a profoundly social art directed primarily to composition with the goal not just of self-expression or communicating, but of publicly persuading a particular audience of various people who are in some way physically present to do something, such as to believe you because they have trust enough in what you say willingly to act, as you have convinced them so to do." End quote. Well, in speaking of an end or purpose, then, we encounter the issue of action, specifically what it is for an artefact viewed socially to motivate us to action. Just now, I made a case for the acculturated or artificial nature of affective engagement as part of the persuasive process. And this case was founded, as I've said, on an Avicennan or Aristotelian model. But in which case, what is it to speak of an artefact or a fiction motivating anything? Is this process at all straightforward? Well, I find this question tackled astonishingly rarely by art historians, possibly because it goes to the very heart of the question of representation itself. In the ancient and medieval worlds, the process is this: a belief about something leads to an emotion or desire, which, together with the belief, persuades us and produces conviction. That in turn motivates us to do something. But how is it to be decided what emotion a work of art arouses? Artifacts can't stipulate or claim appropriate responses. For example, it's a commonplace of dramatic theory that in the theatre, acted emotion A may not induce emotion A in the audience, but rather emotion B. There are no grounds for assuming that where the intended emotion might be pity, the achieved response might not be fear or mockery. Surely all images suffer a lack because they're fictions. As Arthur Danto noted in his trenchant review of David Friedberg's Power of Images in 1989, I want to get back to that book later on, a foundational text in the prizing open of the art-life divide, an image may be judged arousing without provoking arousal. It may be pitiable, but not incur pity. Basically, if an emotion isn't tied to sufficiently convincing belief, it won't move us. In short, the fact that we know that an artifact is a fiction may affect the way we respond to how it produces emotion in us, and this takes us to the core of the problem. This is a simple fact of response, one given particular bite by Kendall Walton's philosophically far-reaching suggestions about the differences between the way we respond to fictions and the way we respond to reality. Kendall Walton is a leading exponent of the philosophy of fiction and its imaginative order. His work grows out of an interest in categories of art. Perceptions depend upon the categorical description under which things are seen. In his book Mimesis and Make-Believe, 1990, and in some subsequent papers, Professor Walton maintains that fictions create imaginary, make-believe worlds with their own ends or purposes, worlds possible within a context or occasion separate from actuality. We know that when we watch a tragedy, that it isn't happening. Even though we're swept away by the fiction, the perception of a fiction is thus a form of aspectual seeing in. We can choose to see it as a fiction. In Walton's theory, fictions are props in a sanctioned game of make-believe, and such props operate intentionally with a deliberately understood or mandated situation of make-believe. So it's a theory of play, essentially. Well, are any of the emotions, then, to ask a broad question, are any of the emotions produced by fictions the same as real-life emotions? Kendall Walton argues that appreciating works of fiction is a genuinely emotional experience, but the question is, what does this experience consist of? To Walton, in fictional or make-believe situations, we encounter emotions, as it were, imaginatively. Walton calls these emotions quasi-emotions. He says, we should be wary of the idea that people literally pity Willy Loman or grieve for Anna Karenina, end quote. While we may see emotion demonstrated or even entertain emotions, think about them, experience them in a way we might experience an emotion while reading, we don't necessarily feel them realistically, because emotion, if I understand the theory right, and I'm simply saying what Kendall Walton is saying, is something encountered imaginatively as well as experienced physically. Such emotions belong to a special category of experience, the fictional or as-if emotion. Hence, just as the process of seeing in entails a voluntary acquiescence in a fiction, so too does it entail a voluntary non-acquiescence. That's vital. We're not coerced by works of art. We're free to believe or to disbelieve a fiction. Clearly, there's a real difficulty in describing the nature of imaginary emotions. Kendall Walton's arguments are sufficiently far-reaching to have provoked a very considerable debate, which I actually and absolutely cannot report on here. The debate seems primarily to concern the question of the actual nature and ontological standing of fiction. This is part of the ontology of fiction debate which is going on, as opposed to of imaginary emotions as opposed to real ones. Are they categorically different? Or is there some sliding scale between fictional and real emotion? But what the ensuing academic debate about the actual character of these emotions, fictional or otherwise, seems to tackle less often is the question of motivation. We know the fiction to be unreal, and we take pleasure in the perception of, that it is unreal, and yet the murder on stage, in the theatre, doesn't provoke the response a real murder might. In an art gallery, we witness the painting of a tiger burning bright in fearful symmetry, but we don't flee from it, any more than we rush onto the stage to assist the tragic hero. An artwork in this reading cannot compel a stance or a feeling in the way that reality can. The object of fiction is not there, and its experience is neither disinterested nor entirely dispassionate. So such experiences seem to enjoy certain freedoms. The freedom not to acquiesce in the fiction, to discount it, the freedom from biological necessity and desires. That is to say that attention to works of art of fictions, cannot be governed by urges or forces within somebody. Fictional emotions seem not to have actual desires at their heart, and I think that's the key thing. Does it have a desire at its heart? And it may be in this that their power to motivate action doesn't seem at all straightforward. You see, a desire to avoid danger is essential to fear in the Aristotelian system, which recognises the appropriateness of emotion and action. In De Anima, Aristotle notes that there's a distinction between the way things appear and belief and desire. Where there are no interests or dangers, there are no desires, merely appearances. And where there are no desires, there are no convictions or motives. So, Kendall Walton's quasi-fictions, lacking desires at their heart, may not be complete, motivationally speaking, and in this Walton's theory serves as an important reminder that the issue of fiction response isn't necessarily at all straightforward. But, you will say, what is much less clear is whether the issue of the actual nature of the emotion produced really matters. An argument about the degree of separation of fact and fiction isn't obviously an argument against the powers of fiction. There's surely a difference of degree and kind between the decline of a Brooklyn salesman, Willy Loman, and Christ dying for humankind on the cross, where the issue is faith in something fully historical, what C.S. Lewis once called a true myth. Little hangs on a fiction, but to believers at least, a great deal hangs on the cross. If quasi-fictions, desireless fictions, don't entail beliefs and desire, we might even ask whether they are simply amoral. Because if there's no desire, what is the position of morality? But we know that fiction as a whole is not a zone of amorality. It's very unclear that within the Western tradition viewed historically, fictions of any type were disbarred from what we might call the education of feeling, that only reality could improve us. Aristotle thought not in the Politics. He notes of the experience of beauty that the habit of feeling pleasure or pain at mere representations isn't so very far removed from the same feeling about realities. A major line of thought indeed stems from Aristotle via the entire medieval pastoral agenda of the Church to Martha Nussbaum, who lays weight on the cognitivity of Aristotle's notion of the passions. This tradition positively stresses the instrumental role of experience in the cultivation of intellectual and moral character and sensibility. By engaging emotions, whether fictional or not, we engage with characters and situations in a way which broadens and deepens our sympathies and understanding. Feeling and learning how to feel is implicit in the practical and moral reasoning that can account for an intentional action and that can give an account of motivation as the product of a reason and not just of a cause. Excuse me. Well, the position of religion in all this is interesting. In the Middle Ages, the Bible and its commentaries were the principal sources of truth, auctoritas. It may be worth recalling that, as the legal historian Kantorowicz noted in writing about the sovereignty of artists, the medieval Roman theory of law had something to say about fiction and what a fiction is, because a jurist, in order to relate law to the natural order of things mimetically, could create from nothing, like God as it were, a persona ficta, and endow it with a reality of its own. The term fiction, of course, derives from fingere, to form or to fashion. Some of the most important moral and theological discourse in the Middle Ages, that found in sermons and shaped by Ciceronian persuasive dynamics, aimed to change hearts and actions precisely by means of workaday fictive exemplar, which had to be at least probable, if not possible. After all, why did Aesop write the fables? They're not real, but they have a serious moral purpose. And indeed, if fictions were disbarred from moral education, the entire economy of medieval representation as having ethically and religiously directed purpose would simply collapse. The whole notion of imitation in medieval spirituality is itself based upon the idea that some things and people are simply superior to others. Here we are at Reims. The smiling image is placed in context, just to stress the kind of colossal context of the West Front at Reims of about 1250, and the way we're obliged as spectators to look up to these images. And we're looking up to them because they're superior, because they are hierarchical, but because they're also attainable, which is, I think, an important aspect of sculpture, that it is graspable. The rhetorical order I discussed precisely underpinned the theological and pastoral objectives of the days. Fictions helped in moral education. Such objectives had to be attainable. Sculpture allows us to grasp them. Admiration, as here on the right-hand side, is a matter for looking up to something, but something which may not be entirely out of reach. As experts on Dante show, Dante's conception of admiration is literally a looking up to something or to someone. We can understand this by reference to Aristotle's discussion in his Poetics of the imitations of actions which are better, the same, or worse than us. This reappears in Northrop Frye's Anatomy of Criticism. Much of the excitement of Gothic cathedrals, such as Reims, derives from the way this idea of imitating, of looking up to the good, is harnessed to giant, wondrous technologies of building to which we literally look up and which magnify us, because although they are very big, they magnify us rather than diminish us. That may sound like a paradox, but I believe it to be fundamental to the way these things work. Well, that this admiration, this looking up, intended to change belief and behaviour seems to me clear. That it must have been thought possible that fictions could help in this agenda seems proven by the evidence. Of course, we delight in being swept away by a fiction, caught up in a story, our cheeks wetted with tears, our hearts and minds magnified. And indeed, such things can change hearts too. The other day in a London newspaper, I read as follows: Joyce Marriott of Purton in Oxford has written a letter to the Times on the subject of how a person's imagination can be unduly influenced by one particular film. The film, Old Yeller, I don't know if you've seen Old Yeller, I've no idea what it is, she says, had such a powerful effect on her that for the past 30 years she's devoted her entire life to animal welfare, dogs in particular. Such is the power of movies, she concludes. And indeed, one might say the same of advertisements. If, as I think is true of our powers of admiration, we respond positively to fictions, knowing that the skill involved in the make-believe is inherently part of the pleasure of the experience, then we're tapping into something humanly more complex and more interesting, more creative than mere response. Fictional emotion might not only match but transcend anything experienced in real life. Surely that's the purpose of fiction, that it takes us out of the self-contained loop of experience that constitutes reality. It enlarges us. Representation may have a power beyond reality, whence, after all, the powers of Dante or Homer. Let me come to my final remarks, which have to do with the art-life divide. I'll try to be as brief as I can. But if all this is true, what of the modern body of arguments that art response is essentially similar to response to the world in general, that in the Middle Ages a basic human instinct, an appetite, operated which inescapably identified an image with what it represents, even if the image is palpably a fiction? There seem to be two parallel modes of inquiry nowadays. One, much more recent, insisting axiomatically on breaching the art-life divide, as in the work of David Friedberg, and the other emerging, as I've tried to explain, from within the theory of fiction, pointing to real, if inconclusive, philosophical difficulties with the dissolution of that very same divide. What then of the art-life barrier? Well, the fundamental moves in the breaking down of this divide were taken in the 20th century by Aby Warburg, Ernst Gombrich, and his student David Friedberg, notably in the latter's book, The Power of Images, which I've already mentioned. The aim of Friedberg's extremely influential book is, in its own words, to ease the disjunction between the image and the real world, to break down the art-life barrier, and to see attempts by high art historians intent on reinforcing that barrier as acts of repression. Because what we're dealing with fictions is, he maintains, fundamentally appetites, which are then repressed. The language of repression is needed, it would seem, because images under this dispensation are taken out of the zone of choice and fiction and are placed into the zone of reality and compulsion. You can't deny the power of an image because the power of an image operates on uncontrollable appetites. Well, Friedberg's position has become something very like a norm in much contemporary literature, and yet it isn't clear to me that it's disposed of the problems posed by the theoreticians of the imagination or of the related problem of the nature and order of fictional response. To retain the idea of choice in perception is to retain intentionality itself. To shed intention is to see responses as essentially reflexive. Response theory and its language of repression and cause purports to get at something deep, biologically authentic, immediate and involuntary. So we're left to choose between ultimately biological causal accounts, which claim to explain aesthetic activity, and non-biological accounts which claim to offer rational, critical insight into aesthetic activity as something that can be reasoned about, because it's not a form of reflex, but a form of thought. The former theories are often treated under the general heading of the term empathy. If a doctor hits you on the knee and your leg duly jumps up, no thought is involved in this, for this is a biological reflex. The question, I think, is whether important aesthetic activity is reflexive in exactly that way. I'd say that the debates about emotion and response we've been looking at today suggest not. In thinking of response and behaviour, we're not thinking of knee-jerk reflexes, but of reflective, intentional thought. The patterns of association and habit to which the artwork is attached. The sight of a real crucifixion, I submit, would provoke reflexive horror. But the medieval crux horribilis of the type we're seeing here, this one I showed earlier, it's in Warsaw, the medieval crook, the horrible cross, or horribilis literally means hair raising. Horror is the kind of business where your hair stands on end. The medieval crux horribilis contextualizes horror and disgust, as does the sculpture at Autun, which talks about terror and horror. They're contextualized. They're made part of an authoritative and inherited pattern of symbolic association, as so much devotional literature shows. The historicity of the crucifixion itself is based on the Psalms, of which the crucifixion is the fulfillment. The crucifixion really and truly, as an image, is a textual and not a historical event. I mentioned this in regard to the columns at Canterbury Cathedral and the hagiography of Thomas Becket. The disgusting realities of Thomas's martyrdom evolve beautifully into consequential thinking about theology and poetry. Such cases are all representations which deepen the experience of actuality. That deepening of experience, informed by significance, by thought, is consequential. Consequential action captures the necessary requirements of will, convention, process, tradition, habit, custom, discipline, and it also allows for artifacts to have emotional powers. Ritual reception of devotional works of art, such as crucifixes or statues of the Virgin Mary, was coded or scripted. To kiss or touch an image, to express devotion towards it, to enact some sort of devotional routine, and to repent as a result, was part of a thoroughly prescriptive body of conduct that could be motivated, informed, and validated by an image, but which can be stated separately from it, and its perception, which has no necessary relation to it. The image doesn't compel. The image gives you the choice, and the choice is an aspect of moral decision-making. Well, nowadays academic standoffs of this type, to enter the final moments of my lecture, seem to have a quasi-religious and sectarian character, all of their own, which may particularly enrage and engage medievalists. As the art-life barrier disappears, all images are rendered in some sense holy or magical. The great narrative of rationalist demagicking set out by the social theorist Weber seems to have gone into reverse. Things are being re-enchanted. David Friedberg states elsewhere that with images, and not just holy images, there's always a problem of inherence, and by inherence he means that the thing has a capacity to move, a life of its own, which is not entirely rational. For Friedberg, Byzantine and later iconoclastic image theory becomes paradigmatic for image theory as a whole, so the whole thing starts to become really rather like a religious debate. In our present unhappy political times, we sometimes hear about emotivist post-truth, and more rarely its chiastic relation post-fiction. Hannah Arendt, you may recall, wrote about defactualization. It's hard to dissociate the two, and I can't help remarking that while we seem rightly concerned about truth, we seem somehow to be less concerned about the status and specialness of fiction, and that's my key emphasis, that fiction is special and separate. Blurring the standing of truth and fiction is not solely a postmodern ploy, however, and exploring and questioning the art-life distinction has been key to several generations of thinkers, from Aby Warburg through to our time and Horst Bredekamp. Well, to sum up, as a humanist interested in rhetorical practices common to the ancient world and the Middle Ages, and in aesthetics, in the embodied nature of sensation, as well as the intellectual capacities of people, I obviously feel that I myself am engaging in a bit of an uphill struggle against the lava flow of more recent image and thing theory. But in defence of diversity of opinion on these matters, I'd simply close with the following. First, I spoke at the start of my lecture of a getting to see, that we get to see the columns at Canterbury as representations of Becket or Becket's martyrdom in a special sense. The getting to see which brings about changed perception is above all a persuasive process. Its success is adjudicated primarily in the public sphere by an arbitration which is essentially social. That perceptions of this type are articulated and justified within the realm of social, not individual awareness. So my analysis is, in a sense, contrary to liberal individualistic approaches to medieval imagery. it's very much in favour of a communal and social understanding of the way the individual works, because we're dealing with a different notion of the individual, it would seem to me. This is key to rhetorical practice, but I merely note the fit with the philosophy of Wittgenstein and his followers in the public nature of language, that meaning is exerted and understood in the public, not the private domain. And that's why I've tried to stress in my writing the role of major church sculpture as something belonging primarily to the domain of public monumentality, not private perception or need. Secondly, I'm struck by the richness of possibility which arises by bringing the type of sanctioned make-believe described by Kendall Walton into a relation yet to be fully worked out of play, ludus, serious play. Since Schiller, via Johann Halsinger, the idea of homo ludens, of humans as essentially or naturally creatively playful creatures, that play is a serious thing, has been taken seriously as a dynamic of human activity, and it has returned recently to the centre of aesthetic speculation. Artefacts are not entirely separate from everyday life, and yet nor are they entirely in earnest. The aspectual seeing of artefacts as diverse as marble revêtements and images can all be said to exemplify the ludic imagination, for they all entail forms of play which serve as enjoyable ends in themselves. And finally, if you think about the Latin, in the notion of play, ludus, lies the notion of illusion, illudere. Willed illusion involves not false belief, but pleasurable play, an idea recognised in the ancient and medieval worlds and one basis for challenging the idea that illusion was not a medieval category. Properties and qualities, facts and values are interdependent. And it seems to me that one of the main aims and accomplishments of this interdependence lies in the production of persuasive figments, which self-consciously acknowledge that relationship. So in making a case for the specialness of fiction, imperfect, I admit, this paper has been an excursus into my own intellectual history and mental training, influenced strongly, it must be admitted, by the School of Analytical Philosophy in my own university in Cambridge. It helps to explain why I've said the things that I have in my recent published work, and above all, why I, for one, believe that certain problems just won't go away, no matter how much we may wish that they might. I'm extremely grateful to you for being so patient to listen to this formulation of my thinking, and for allowing me to say a little bit more about it today in such distinguished company. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Binski, for that riveting and stimulating talk. My mind is reeling in a good way. I hope that members of the audience will have questions and reactions to your talk.
Of course.
And so I welcome the floor to questions both from people who are here physically present, and also we have the listeners who are not in attendance physically but live streaming, and we also have questions from them. So questions from the floor, so we begin there. Questions for our technology specialists. How would you like us to best handle the questions from your perspective? Questions? How would we do it to ask them best?
If we have any questions come online, we'll pass them on. I've not seen an online question, but anybody can ask a question from the audience and we'll hear it.
Okay, great. Thanks.
Thank you for your talk. That was really enjoyable.
Thank you. I have to ask you if you're in master to speak up, because I'm absolutely deaf as a post.
And also the mic needs to pick up your voice.
Oh.
Thanks.
No, you're doing fine. Just yeah.
Sure. So you had talked a bit about the skill that is involved in creating fictions and how that can be an activity of pleasure. So I was wondering how that idea might connect to the activity of artists and maybe their pleasure in this act of creating objects.
Yeah, I think it's absolutely fundamental, and I think we've drifted a long way away from that idea because we've drifted so far from the idea of pleasure. delighting in things. It's a biblical idea. I dance before the Lord and delighted in my works, as it were. The notion of delight, delectatio, is a fundamental one in medieval aesthetics. It could be a theological idea. It could be the delight a patron takes in what they have accomplished. I think Suger uses the expression. When out of the delight, he says, ex delectio, I consider the many virtues of the saints and the precious stones at Saint Denis. The whole experience, he says, of contemplating jewels, beautiful treasures, leads him to be, as it were, in some strange netherworld between the slime of the earth and the joys of heaven. Do you remember that marvellous passage? But it starts ex delectione, out of the delight I take in. And to my mind, that is a notion we should reinsert into the history of manufacture, of execution, the pleasure taken in execution, skilled execution, habitual execution, which, as with skilled cooking and things working out well, or in skilled performance of music, is intensely pleasurable. And yet how shy we've become of talking about this in the last generation or more. It would seem to me, I don't wish to speak about all disciplines, but it would certainly seem to me in the history of art, one thing that in my dotage what I've been trying to do is to get the notion of delight back into these activities and to take pleasure, and not feel ashamed of it in some way. Yeah, sure. I mean, I'm sure we could. I'm sure we could think at great length about how whether artists did take pleasure in what they did. That seems like a very abstract question, but it does seem to me, in principle, a very fundamental idea, with a substantial underpinning that the notion of delight as a kind of launching pad for the appreciation and execution of art is very important. It's not a very perfect answer or complete answer to your question, but it's a very important starting point. Thank you. Don't be shy. Yes. Oh, yes.
So I'm really interested in this idea of these different kinds of fictions and how people react differently to something in reality, like a real violent act in front of their eyes, versus a fiction representing a violent act, and how you had brought up the idea of a true myth. So how some fictions might evoke that idea of being based in truth, reminding us of something that people believe actually happened, as opposed to something that's more clearly a fictional character, more complete construction. So do you feel that that impacts how people interact with these kinds of fictions, or they all kind of fall under this umbrella of fiction?
Oh, no. I think it's very important to recognise that, after all, let's face it, when you're dealing with revealed religion, there are fictions which are more authoritative than others, and where the issue of belief comes in, if you see what I mean, because what I'm arguing, of course, is that fiction as a form of beholding, imaginative beholding, of seeing in, is necessarily voluntary. But where does that leave you when where your fiction is, so to speak, a matter of belief? Look, I'm not exactly taking sides in the quasi-fiction, real fiction. I'm drawing attention to it as a way of problematizing the, in my view, reductive, empathetic view of art response, which is that it is exactly the same thing to respond to an artwork as it is to respond to real life. I mean, it seems to me that point of view is reductive and driven essentially by appetites which can't be denied. And it precisely disallows the possibility that we may not consent to what the fiction, in other words, we can see that the image is arousing, but we don't necessarily feel aroused because we don't assent to it arousing us. Do you see what I mean? So I have a very different perspective about this. And all I would say is that I think Walton is onto something. He seems to be describing something that is in a way true. And I think it's just a very interesting experiment when we read moving literature. You'll notice several things which very much relate to occasion, because, by the way, the context in which something is read is very important. I say, number one, there's possibly a sliding scale between quasi-emotion and real emotion. It's not one or the other. It's it's a gradation, and that needs to be further thought through philosophically. So I would start from the idea that they're not necessarily opposed to one another. Anyway, I'm not answering your question terribly clearly. It's a very good question, and I think the question of religion is fundamental, and it's a question that Kendall Walton's theory is not designed to consider.
Yes.
That's the problem, because actually Kendall, as those of you who've read Kendall Walton's work, it's extremely interesting, and I think he is onto something, but it's not historical in character. And the question is, well, when you get into, so to speak, an ethically directed regime where issues of belief are involved, and therefore choice is qualified, how does the fiction operate? Well, I merely raise this because I don't see it discussed very often. It seems to me an interesting problem. And by the way, I had a very nice correspondence with Kendall Walton, who knows about me. He said, my theory is not intended. I hope I don't do him any injury when I say that he maintained that his theory is not intended to operate in that kind of way. His theory has to do with green slime. The man watching a film of green slime coming through the television, and he feels that there's a form of fear. But the fact of green slime coming through, and whether you feel real fear in the face of a fiction. No, you don't, because there's no desire. There's no fear because that's to do with desires. We can see that's a completely different order of problem from the crucifixion or Willy Loman or whatever. Yeah. So anyway, good question. I think you were going to ask.
Yes, I have a related question.
Yes.
Actually, so went in a good order.
Thank you.
So I'm thinking about this thing you said in the middle of your talk
Yes.
today about an artwork that portrays emotion A, but we experience emotion B.
Yeah.
So for example, an artwork that shows us an arousing image, but we are not aroused.
Just so.
And so I'm thinking about this in the context of how we might evaluate the, for lack of a better word, success of an image in
Yes.
accomplishing its ends.
Yes.
If it portrays emotion A, but we instead feel emotion B, is it successful in its ends?
No. No, not really. Well, it would seem, first of all, you see, sorry, I gave you a slightly harsh answer to that. I mean, images don't succeed or fail, absolutely, but you do raise an important point. And it's one that comes up, for example, in relation to the wise and foolish virgins that we were talking about earlier on. Big debate about this at the moment. Because my reading of them is that they are as much designed to provoke disapproval, a sort of punitive set of emotions as empathy, to hit hearts. And you might say, well, if we felt empathetic towards them, sorry for the, deeply saddened by them, and all that, and you felt for them, well, the punitive and ethical character of the imagery would have failed, because it's heaven and hell, it's ecclesia, synagoga, they're part of a package of thinking. There's a terrific insight into this by Thomas Aquinas himself, who is not an easy read, it must be said. But Aquinas draws attention to the following problem. In heaven, the blessed can see the tormented in hell. And it's like Dives and Lazarus, where the poor man can see the rich man being tormented in hell. And he says, is it wrong for the blessed in hell to delight, I think is the word he uses, in the sight of the sufferings of the damned? And because surely this would be most terrible, unchristian cruelty. You can't delight in other people's suffering. He says, because in the Aristotelian scheme, intention is everything. Of course you can, because the suffering serves the greater good, is fruitful, because it is the working of God's justice, which means that effectively we can look at something that is pitiable and not feel pity, but contempt, because we say this is the working of divine. And that's why I'm against what one might call the imposition on these such imagery, of what I would call straightforward naturalistic, what poor girls, I feel so sorry for them, whereas in fact, in the medieval period, it would be part of a much more punitive mindset that would say, aha, tee-hee, or that they're silly girls who got their just desserts, if you see what I mean. Nasty to us, but that's what I think would qualify the notion of the success of the image. Do you see what I mean? So you touch on a very interesting question. It's important to remember that artifacts fail all the time. The history of art is the history of the failure of things as much as of the successes. It's just that what one might call the positivity bias leads you not to hear about it. Thank you. Yes?
Could I ask a follow-up to that very question?
Yes.
So, do we have to choose which, you gave us a list of possible responses to the Foolish Virgin, but it seems as though we don't have a choice not to choose. But can we? You see what I'm saying?
You mean, can you remain open-minded?
Like, does this view of representation
Yes.
give us, like, the possibility of a simultaneous reaction?
Yes,
To
well,
change examples, can I laugh at Othello and still think it's a beautiful tragedy?
yes, of course.
Cool, okay.
Well, of course you can. Absolutely. Because because you can take pleasure in its forms without regard to its significance. I mean, as it were, light-headed, empty pleasure in taken in something is a perfectly legitimate response to it. It doesn't all have to be serious and in earnest. I mean, these are problems that relate to marginalia, the whole history of border representations, which have been almost entirely excluded from the history of humour because they purport to serve a subversive or ideological purpose in recent literature. Well, again, you can probably guess what I think about them, which is it's not that they're intended to be funny, but they're intended to create an experience of which an aspect is amusement. And of course you can do that. Well, but with the nature of a fiction, that's because fictions don't stipulate. Othello doesn't stipulate. Sorry, let me bowl it back to you.
No, I have nothing to say. That's great.
Okay, good. Arely.
If I may return us to something you touched on earlier, which is when we have the intersection between, say top 1 and top 2. In what ways does the physical environment, especially in the case of medieval sculptural ensembles that are integrated or inserted with an architectural framework, in what ways does the architectural setting amplify, distract, or modulate in some way the ability of the works to motivate action in their viewers?
Well, you touch on the key intellectual and literary issue of how the two talks are going to be related. And they're going to be related precisely by the idea that I was talking about a little bit with the West Front at Reims, the idea of magnification. Because what I would argue is that there is a conjoint regime it's a moral aesthetic regime that doesn't recognise, I think, a conflict between. I mean, I see you getting at the point of conflict. It's generic in nature. That this is all the Gothic art of this type is a form of magniloquentia, great speech, which magnifies. I mean, it magnifies morally, aesthetically, psychologically, and I think the connective tissue is the brilliant way that the Gothic artists and great artists of any kind actually integrate those two because of the profoundly architectural character of much Gothic sculpture. It is, the column figure, the profoundly sort of architectonic quality of it would create a problem if the two were at odds. You might ask, well, how do they? The question of how do they distract, whether they distract from one another, I find much harder to answer. I would argue that the generic issue has to do with trying to recognise that these arts aren't to do with common daily speech or soma humilis, what Eric Auerbach called soma humilis. I think that's an error. I think that if we think of them as to do with not the sublime, but something very near it, great speech, uplift, exaltation, all those things that I talked about, then I think we see the common ground between the two. And I should add that by the time this is published, it's going to get a bit bigger, and there's going to be stuff on sound and music as deposits of affective attention. This is a huge topic. It's a wonder world of material. So I hope I can connect, Amy. Does that in any way answer your?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, good phew. That's relief. Thank you.
Creates a sense of enhanced anticipation.
Yes. Oh, good. Oh, well, I hope I don't let you down. Yes.
I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about whether or not this function of fiction and like playful interpretation and this larger viewing process that you've so eloquently walked us through shifts when we're looking at works on a small scale rather than a large scale, when you can't look up to these works anymore, and it's kind of a reverse viewing scenario in which you yourself are looking down upon.
Okay, I can answer that absolutely clearly, and I have answered it because I've written a paper about microarchitecture, albeit in French, which answers it. In medieval, forgive me. I mean, sorry, that sounds boastful. But what I just want to say, I've thought about this one. Okay, and the answer is an interesting one, and it lies within point number one. We were talking about this in our seminar earlier on, ladies and gentlemen. Forgive me, but I'll just repeat it. Opposites go together. Bitter, sweet, large and small are all related. In rhetoric, in musical compositional theory, two techniques in similar way, which are contrarian, but which work together, are coupled. One is called augmentatio, or auxasis, making something larger, and the other is diminutio, making it more compact or shorter, smaller, whatever. They're opposites, but they're connected on the scales. That's the way to think about it. It's not a sliding scale, but they're brought into a balance. It is no coincidence that the micro arts, the tiny Bibles, the miniature jewels, the exquisite little ivories, flourish in the commercial centres of northern France in the 13th century that are producing the giant cathedrals. I mean, where they're not simply big, they're mega big. I mean, they are heroic efforts to push a technology that way, while the nano arts are going in the opposite direction. Paradox? No, because things opposites are related dialectically. That's what you'd expect. Just as with a pietà, it's bittersweet. You know, that's how interesting aesthetic ideas operate. They operate not by contradiction, but by, as it were, the blending of it, which gives you pleasure. That's a very Aristotelian, Avicennan way of looking at it. Does that answer your question? Okay.
If we don't have any pressing questions in the Q&A chat, just to thank you for the stimulating lecture for one of the series, then I ask you to join me in thanking Professor Binski wholeheartedly.